Hello. Well, never let it be said I don't take notice of my subscribers. There's a chap here called David who sent me a message under my last video saying, "Please, Granny, could you talk a little about William Blake's The Sick Rose? I've despaired of understanding it myself, and your two rare literary excursions are superb." Well, how could a girl turn down a request like that? So and in any case, I need to clean my mind from all the nonsense. What I am going to do is tell you how I feel about the poem. How I feel about what it means. That doesn't mean to say I'm right. I would like to be able to call up the spirit of William Blake and ask him, but quite frankly, he was so stoned most of the time. I mean, mentally, I don't think he actually resorted to drugs, although he might have done that too. But he had visions and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that he actually would remember a couple of years later. You know, there's a famous quote, I think it was Browning, who said to Elizabeth Barrett in the play The Barretts of Wimpole Street, when she asked him, "What does this line mean in your poem?" And he said something like, "Madam, when I wrote that, the meaning was clear to me and to God. Now it's clear only to God." All right. So I'm not sure that Blake knew exactly what he was saying, because he used a method of thinking that layered different feelings one on top of the other. So look, I'm going to pick out some ideas, and if you think they make sense, then they make sense to you. Right. So first, I'll read you The Sick Rose, and I'll put a picture of it up here. It's a very short poem, so this is good. Internet sound bites. This is nice. Oh, but by the way, it has some application to today. He is making a comment. I'm going to be reading a couple more poems. Again, nothing very long, but he's talking about society of his time. And of course, the criticisms he has of the society, although the focus of the society has changed, his basic criticism of it is probably is pretty spot on, actually. So look, let's read The Sick Rose. "O Rose, thou art sick." Now, just a minute, I want to tell you, I always burst into tears with Blake poems, so I might have to stop while I stop snivelling, because that's a little bit embarrassing when I'm reading some of these poems. So, okay, if you see any jerking and I'm here 1 minute and then here the next, you'll know what happened. I was trying to find the I was trying to find the toilet paper to blow my nose. All right, let's start again. The Sick Rose by William Blake, and this one, David, is for you. "O Rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy." All right. And yeah, it's very portentous. And you think, what's that about? Well, I'm going to read you two more poems. And the first one is The Garden of Love. Now, you see, he has this image of love and gardens. So you've got to remember that, because that's in his mind. And when you see anything to do with flowers, you will know that he regards love as a garden, although this garden has been pretty well trampled upon. I'll put it up here. The Garden of Love. Oh, and by the way, this was written at about the same time as The Sick Rose. They're all in a series of poems called Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. All right. "I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and 'Thou shalt not' writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love, that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. Now, okay, so here you have a picture of love that's been completely ruined by religion. You know, they built a chapel over his garden, a garden of nature. And on the other hand, you see, he has Christian imagery here, which is what you might call positive Christian imagery, because that last line, 2 lines, priests in black gowns, binding with briars my joys and desires. Now, you have to remember that there are hundreds of paintings depicting the Roman soldiers making a crown of thorns for Jesus. That's a very common theme. And Jesus is sitting there, or being held there rather, and they're pulling these briars over his head. So that's the end of this poem, is actually an evocation of a suffering Jesus. And what he appears to be drawing together is the idea that the religion is actually crucifying Jesus. Religion is crucifying Jesus. The way Christianity has developed itself is crucifying Jesus. So there's that little... You've got to remember that when you look at the rest of his poetry as well. Blake is one poet that you can't actually study without knowing. You can't look at one of his poems without looking at the others. I mean, Keats's Grecian urn, like an urn, stands on its own. You could read that and know nothing else about Keats. But in Blake, he didn't write great epics in that way. So you have to look at all of his poems, and that's why he bound them together in one volume, because they were never intended to be isolated in that way. Okay, so we have this knowledge of what Blake thought of religion, at least the religion that was being propagated in the 18th century. Now I'm going to read another slightly longer poem by Blake called London. And so here you'll see it's a little bit longer still. I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames doth flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, just before I carry on, I want you to take note of the first 2 lines. A chartered street, a chartered Thames, means, I assume, it's been mapped. And that's important. First of all, he is writing at a time when London was being mapped, and everything had its place. That he's talking about bureaucracy, really, isn't he? But I want you to remember that idea of the map, because I'm going to bring that up a bit later on. Okay, so now he's talking about the people he meets on these clean, mapped streets. I mean, obviously they weren't all clean, but, the mapped streets, the bureaucratic grid. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's ear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. That last, I'm not going to go through the whole poem because I'm not analysing this poem, but that last sentence is, last verse is important because he talks about the youthful harlot. Now, this youthful harlot is cursing the baby she's just had, but she would be cursing the people who weren't paying her as well in the midnight streets. I suppose that in the 19th century, I know, and I should think at this time as well, it was a common superstition if a man had syphilis to find a virgin because that would clean him of the syphilis. Yeah, people did believe that. So they would be infecting these girls at the age of about 13. They'd buy them from their drunken parents. They'd buy a night with one of these girls, and the girl would get syphilis as well. And then she'd pass it round to her customers. Now, syphilis was a big problem in the 18th century in London. I think it was estimated, they didn't actually differentiate that well between gonorrhea and syphilis. Some doctors thought that one was an earlier version of the other. But the estimate was that about 1 in 5 of all Londoners had venereal disease. And it was, especially syphilis, an extremely disfiguring and horrible illness. It led to, well, look, I don't need to go into the details. You can find out what happens with syphilis. But one of the things is your nose tends to drop off. It's not nice. So we have here the harlot's curse, and the harlot who blights with plagues the marriage hearse. That is, somebody gets syphilis, he marries somebody, the family becomes infected with syphilis, the wife, the stillborn children, all the rest of it, and marriage becomes a death sentence. So you can look at it like that. You can also talk about marriage in his eyes being a religiously sanctioned institution, and, you know, what he thinks of religion from looking at your Garden of Love poem where I just read. All right, so we've got those two poems, and you should remember them when I'm talking a bit more about the sick rose. So first, I'll talk about the syphilis epidemic. Which I have a little clip here. It started in 1495. The reason it spread so quickly after 1495 was Charles VIII of France was busy invading Spain. Busy invading Italy, or part of Italy anyway. And then the soldiers went home and spread the disease all over the place. And of course, Naples was a port, so, well, you know, you take it from there. It says here, although it didn't have the horrendous mortality of the bubonic plague, its symptoms were painful and repulsive. The remedies were few and hardly efficacious. They used mercury. I don't know whether it actually helped or not, but it turned your teeth green. All right. So that's that. Now I want to talk about the Napoleonic Wars. The United Kingdom's struggle with France during the Napoleonic Wars required the British Army to expand rapidly. The whole military thing really started in 1793. That's really when the big call up and the sudden need for more soldiers happened. And it says here, the army still struggled to raise the troops required to replace the discharged, wounded and dead as the war against France continued. As early as 1794, 18,600 soldiers died on active service, and another 40,500 men were discharged. And they were discharged because they were wounded, ill, or, just useless as soldiers anymore. Many of those soldiers would have venereal diseases. And so soldiers were often blamed for, with some justification, for the spread of venereal diseases. And of course, what made it worse, the British Army, it says here, also used foreign volunteers such as French royalists, Germans, Greeks, and Corsicans. So there'd be a lot of foreign soldiers in London, specifically in London. And the idea was that London was just rotting away. Now, I'm going to show you that map of London. Do you notice? That's the Thames in the middle. Looks like a worm to me. And the Thames was what brought the soldiers into London. Everything into London, by the way. Everything came in through the Thames. Nowadays, it's the modern container ships can't get up the Thames. It's not deep enough. In many places, not wide enough. But at that time, merchant ships, they came right into London. That's why London is where it is. And so there is a sort of admixture here of the idea of a lot of soldiers and foreigners in London, and they're all being brought in by this river here, which, when you look at a map, which is what Blake would have done, resembles a worm crawling through the centre of this big centre of population. So I'd say that at least part of this poem has to do, with the rose, which is a symbol of England, being London, and it's got this worm going through the middle of it, which is rotting it. Here, let's have a look at this. This is The Military and Popular Disorder in England by Clive Emsley. The 1790s were a decade of crisis for Britain. The war against revolutionary France, which began in February 1793, put enormous strains on the economy. That would mean more poor people, on manpower and on finances. Plebeian radicalism mushroomed in 1792, and after 1795, elements of the radical movement, which had weathered the storm of the Loyalist counterattack, plunged into a twilight world of conspiracy. Well, I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about in that way, but it's obvious he's talking about the idea that everyone in London would be feeling very unsettled about the direction society is going in. And that's why, one of the reasons why I'm taking this poem to analyse it, because I'm showing you that Blake was voicing an idea of London in disorder, and London being England, the rose, as something that's rotting. And let's go back to that poem. Hang on, it's underneath this stack of stuff now. Here we are. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. In my opinion, that howling storm is the French wars. Let's look at this poem again. And layers of it. The first is a story of physical love. It's a poem about physical love. Thy bed of crimson joy, female genitalia have been likened to a flower by various classical philosophers. And of course, the colours are, well, maybe not crimson, but, near enough. And so we have here a description of the sexual act that has brought disease to the body of the woman, really. And now we're talking about the rose, which is a flower which has been invaded by some parasite or a worm of some sort, which has got into the leaves, petals, the bed of crimson joy, and is chomping away and killing the rose. So that's the second one. And the third one is the rose as a symbol of Britain, because the rose is a symbol of Britain. I don't know how many of you know that. There's the Tudor rose, which was Henry VIII's rose, which he wanted, well, it was Henry VII's rose. You know about the Wars of the Roses. So it was the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster, and they were at it hammer and tongs for years. And it was finished finally when Henry VII took over. He took the white rose of Yorkshire and the red rose of Lancashire and he merged them. So the Tudor rose was red and white. It had two sets of different coloured petals, and that was the unity that he manufactured out of the two factions. So that's always been a symbol of Britain, and you'll find roses all over British iconography. And you'll find a lot of roses in Shakespeare as well, come to think of it. So he's talking about the rose, England being sick, and the invisible worm that's coming in from the howling storm, the wars, which bring soldiers and illnesses into the country, as well as poverty and just wounded people. And that has taken root in the country and, sort of clamped in, and it's destroying Britain, England specifically. He's talking about England. All right, that's my interpretation of the sick rose. Take that how you want. So there's the sick rose, David. I hope you're happy with that. And everybody else, I hope you enjoyed that as well. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.